Today, we're going to break down how the job market has shifted and what it means for product managers and what it means for engineers and sort of what the implications are if you are job searching. So, number one, the job market has become flat. And so previously in the 2010s, the job market for product managers, the job markets for engineers steadily went up. That doesn't mean they were at the same size. We'll get into that. But at the end of the day, there was steady acceleration across both job families, which means more jobs and roles were active. Once interest rates rose, that changed. At the end of the day, since interest rates rose, product management roles and engineering management roles are almost exactly flat. They're up 3 or 4% in 2.5 years. Not much change at all. And that's despite all of the excitement and all of the heartache about the jobs that were laid off and the mass layoffs that big companies did and startups going to the wall. Despite all of that, the job market is essentially flat. I know, I'm surprised too. And I actually appreciate this. Lenny is the one that brought this to my attention. If you read his newsletter, he had a piece on the job market, and it kind of inspired me to do some thinking and digging. At the end of the day, when we think about this, the thing that stands out to me is that if you are used to living in a world where you are accelerating so fast from a jobs perspective, going to flat, which isn't down, but going to flat from a job market perspective feels like a kind of death. It feels terrible because you're used to a much looser market. You're used to the next job being around the corner because there's so many jobs available. And there are more jobs available if you're growing rapidly than there are applicants, which is a very applicant-friendly market. I remember it was not that long ago that when you were hiring, we would sit in rooms and talk about whether the person that we wanted to hire would only be an 80 or 90% fit, but you could coach them into the role. And the reason we had those conversations back then is because the market was so tight for employers. You had to make a call on who you would hire, knowing that the employee, that the applicant had the power in the relationship because there were so many roles open and there was so much active hiring going on. And that leads me sort of to the second thing. And this number is also, I think it came out of the Lenny newsletter. The market is at about 10% turnover a year if you do the math. So it's roughly, on average, think of it as like 30K and change in PM roles are changing over, maybe a little bit over, call it closer to 40K. And that's roughly 10% of the active roles, right? So 450K active roles for PMs, 40K turnover. That's doesn't strike me as ridiculously unhealthy. It just means that it's sort of a stable market. We're in a stable state, and about 10% of PMs are turning over a year. And I think where we feel the pain is kind of what I called out earlier, where there's this idea of deceleration, and you're just sort of hitting this expectation of growth, and you're not seeing it anymore. And so suddenly, for people who had expected their careers to persist in this state where it was always going to be applicant friendly, where there were always going to be more jobs than applicants, it just isn't true anymore, is the way I'll put it. And that has generated a tremendous shock for a lot of people. So when you look at that market, and by the way, it's true for engineering too. Like engineering has always been obviously more jobs than product, but it's similar story, right? They climb up, they flatten out in 2022. I think it's roughly 3.7 million engineering jobs now, which is roughly the same as what it was, maybe slight growth. What does this mean for hiring and for applicants? That's kind of where I want to spend the meat of this time, the bulk of this time. Fundamentally, I think we are characterizing hiring as easier in this market incorrectly. It is not easier. If you want an approximate fit, it is easier. But if you are expecting a really precise fit for the role, it has never been harder. And the reason it's never been harder is because you have to look at a much larger sea of applicants, a much larger volume of applicants, and wade through them and assess them correctly. And it's also harder because executives expect that the market will be easier. Executives expect that you will be able to find someone quickly. Executives expect a precise fit because they see the volume too. And so the challenge is really the sortation function, the filter function that we do for interviews, which everyone who's done the process knows is not perfect, but it's the best thing we've figured out so far. That process is really under strain right now. It's under strain especially because AI has enabled applicants to really scale up what they apply to. And that just makes it harder for recruiters to find really good candidates because they're sorting through a bunch of resumes, and the resumes now have really leveled up. People are using AI for their resumes. People are trying to stand out, and individually that makes sense. And in a group, it means it's hard to tell the difference between all of these different resumes, which is why I tend to recommend that people draft with AI and then finish and polish as a human, because that human touch does stand out when you've stared at AI resumes all day. It really does make a difference. So it's really tough to find an exact fit. We probably don't have all the tool sets we're going to have. I think there's room for innovation on the hiring front here as AI starts to shape how we produce text. And I'll be curious to revisit this topic in a year or so and see what technologies have emerged. I think it's also hard from an applicant perspective, and I want to sort of talk about that a little bit as well. At the end of the day, I think applicants tend to blame themselves when it's not you. We tend to take personal responsibility, and I've been in this boat too. We tend to say, oh, it's me. It's something I did, right? Like if I had answered that question better, I would have gone farther. It's almost never a single question. Almost never. Almost always, it is an overall assessment of their sense of the fit for the role. And they are looking for someone who will thrive in the role. And if they don't see that in you, if they don't think you'll thrive, they tend to pass because they need someone who can thrive in the role. Employers need someone who can thrive in the role. And so if you're in a world where you're getting rejections, don't take that personally, but do take it productively. Because even if it's not you from an individual rejection perspective, you can still shape your future by shaping the positioning you put forward across your applicant surface area. So across all the applications that you're putting out there, your overall surface in the market, you can start to learn from the rejections and shape how you position yourself. So that includes resume tweaks. It also includes story tweaks and interviews, sort of positioning yourself differently, being more precise, being more coherent, getting that practice in front of the mirror or with a good friend. And it includes understanding how the story you're telling does or does not line up with what the recruiter and the hiring manager are looking for. So much of this work is essentially getting them to imagine that they are working with you. And if they can imagine it, you are so far ahead of the game. You are so far ahead of the game. You're like in the top 5% or 1% of applicants already. And so think about it that way. Think about it as any given rejection isn't necessarily personal, but over time I can shape my applicant trajectory. The other thing I will call out is that referrals, while important, are no longer a golden ticket. Referrals do matter. They increase candidate quality. They increase the probability that you will get interviews. But they are not something that is, wow, okay, this person is someone we have to get to a team loop right away. And I've seen that happen in the past. When we had rapidly accelerating jobs, it was like, we need to get through this process really quickly. We don't want to lose this person. They're probably in 6 other conversations. Let's get them right to a team loop. That's not how it works with referrals anymore. Referrals get scrutinized. They just get oftentimes at least a courtesy call from a recruiter or a more friendly look at the resume, because there's this assumption that if you're referring someone, you know them a little bit and you have that extra validation of the quality of work they do. And that kind of leads me to my conclusion, which is ultimately this whole talent matching exercise is about corporations trying to optimize for the talent they need for particular tasks. And it's applicants trying to figure out what corporations are a great fit for them. And we just have very inefficient methods to do that. And I think that I'm excited to see how AI enables us to do some real disruption here, not in terms of generating text and like spamming recruiters, because I think that's sort of a first generation hack. And I think that one is going to get arms raced away as on the other side, recruiters get AI tooling that enables them to filter a lot of the less meaningful text out. So I think that's a limited window where that's going to be at all helpful. And I don't know that it's all that helpful right now if you're just spamming people with AI generated resumes. But I do think there's opportunity around optimizing process, thinking carefully about how AI can help us to consider all applicants more carefully. And there's probably opportunities around leveraging artificial intelligence to give us a second pair of eyes on choices and to give us more insight into the way we conduct interviews so that we can be more fair, more frequent, cover more of the population we want to talk to, and ultimately come to higher quality choices. We will see. We will see. It's early yet for AI in the talent market. I guess the close, right? Like I opened talking about how job deceleration has felt like a death to many of us. And I don't want to lose that. It's been a grieving process. I think one of the pieces that I'm going to be watching is there a reacceleration when interest rates come back down, or does it stay flat? Because the timing is really tightly connected. The timing for the flattening in the market is tightly tied to the tightening of venture capital, which was associated with interest rates getting tightened, like raised. So eventually interest rates are going to get cut again. Does that change the picture, or do we see enough efficiencies? Do we see enough of a stable state that we've hit now that jobs remain roughly steady? I don't know. Nobody has the answer. Nobody has a crystal ball. I will be curious to see.